Have you ever stopped to think about what could cause such an incredible civilization, with roads, aqueducts, and an empire that dominated the world, to simply fall apart? How could anyone watch an empire like Rome, which seemed unbreakable, fall so quickly? Imagine being at its peak, with everything under control, and suddenly everything falls apart. Now, imagine if you were there, watching Rome, the greatest empire of all, make 10 fatal mistakes. And these mistakes, one by one, began to weaken the foundation of the empire. They were small mistakes, which seemed harmless at first, but which together caused a collapse so great that no one could stop it. It's not like a simple stumble. It's like a house of cards collapsing because one card at the bottom was misplaced. And you know what's most frightening? These mistakes weren't caused by invaders or anything outside of the Romans' control. They were decisions made within Rome by those who were supposed to protect the empire. And what happened next? The empire, which seemed unbeatable, ended up being defeated by itself. It sounds like a fictional story, but it really happened. So get ready, because in this video, we will discover the 10 fatal mistakes that ended the Roman Empire. Stay tuned. You will see how small mistakes can lead even the greatest civilization to fall. And who knows, you may even realize that some of these mistakes may happen closer to you than you think. Make sure you are already subscribed to the channel and become part of our community. Mistake number 1, economic crisis. Have you ever wondered how an empire that dominated the world for centuries could have been destroyed by its own coins? The story of the economic collapse of the Roman Empire is a fascinating account of fatal mistakes and financial desperation that opened the door to ruin. Imagine a scenario in which coins, once symbols of power and stability, become a weight that sinks an entire system. This is the starting point of our journey. At the height of its power, Rome was an economic giant. Its roads connected regions, trade flowed in all directions, and the imperial treasury seemed inexhaustible. But behind this facade of prosperity, the empire was eroding. Inflation was one of the first symptoms of this decline. To finance their military campaigns and the lavish lifestyles of the elite, emperors began to devalue their currencies, reducing the amount of gold and silver in them. Imagine the impact. Money that had once had a solid value was no longer reliable. Prices were skyrocketing, and confidence in the system was beginning to crumble. Now think of a Roman farmer accustomed to selling his crops at a fair price. With inflation out of control, the money he received no longer bought the supplies his family needed. Food production, which was the backbone of the Roman economy, collapsed. To make matters worse, land was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy people, while small farmers were pushed away from their properties. Without these producers, Rome lost its ability to sustain its own cities. Did you know that Rome faced a real labor crisis? This was because the empire depended on slaves for practically everything: construction, agriculture, domestic services. But as the conquest declined, so did the number of slaves captured. With no hands to work and no plan to adapt the economic system, Rome found itself in a fragile position. And now we come to the most critical point: military spending. With vast borders to protect, Rome needed to constantly invest in its army. But how could it finance this without resources? The solution was simple but devastating: collect more taxes. Ordinary citizens found themselves burdened with unsustainable taxation, while the elite often escaped these obligations. This created inequality that eroded the social foundation of the empire. Now think about it. What would it be like to live in a world where money was worthless, food was scarce, and the government seemed incapable of solving any problem? This was the reality for millions of Romans at the time. An empire that had once inspired respect and fear came to be seen as incapable of protecting and sustaining its people. And you, How would you feel about being part of this scenario? If you were in the shoes of a Roman citizen, how would you react to a government that consumes all your resources and demands even more? Comment below how you think you would have handled this crisis. In the meantime, get ready, because the next fatal mistake is even more impressive. Rome was surrounded by enemies, but some of them were even more dangerous than you imagine. Mistake number 2, barbarian invasions. Imagine being inside the walls of Rome and hearing the sound of foreign armies approaching in the distance. The Romans, who had previously seen themselves as invincible, now trembled before people they considered barbarians. But how did this happen? How was such a powerful empire crushed by those who had long been underestimated? The mistakes that led to the barbarian invasions began long before the first attack. The empire's borders were vast and difficult to defend. For decades, the Romans struggled to keep their lands safe, but the legions were worn down by civil wars and corrupt administrations. Lacking resources and with a demoralized army, Rome became vulnerable to attacks from people such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns. Did you know that the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD was a historic landmark? The citizens, accustomed to the grandeur of the Eternal City, were taken by surprise to see their riches plundered and their streets taken over by foreigners. This event was not only a military defeat, but a profound blow to Roman pride. What is even more striking is how the barbarians were treated before this. Many Germanic peoples sought refuge within the empire, fleeing other threats such as the Huns. Instead of properly integrating them, Rome relegated them to a position of inferiority, creating tensions that soon turned into revolts. A clear example is the famous Visigothic king Alaric, who initially served in the Roman army, but eventually turned against it after years of neglect and mistreatment. The collapse of the frontiers was not just a military defeat. It was a reflection of the empire's inability to adapt to new realities. The old tactics and alliances failed, and the barbarians took advantage of every gap to advance. But what really caused these invasions? Was it simply military weakness, or was there something deeper at play? Before we answer, I want to know, do you think the Roman neglect was intentional, or the result of a system that no longer worked? Leave your comment and stay with me, because in the next chapter, the division of the empire itself will show how unity is essential for survival. Mistake number 3, division of the empire. Imagine an empire so vast and powerful that in its attempt to remain strong, decided to divide itself in two. What seemed like a practical solution turned out to be one of the most fatal mistakes in history. When Emperor Diocletian decided to divide the Roman Empire into western and eastern parts, the aim was to facilitate the administration of such a gigantic territory. However, this strategy had consequences that would resonate for centuries. The division brought challenges that were not on the radar of its creators. On the one hand, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, was prospering thanks to a stable economy and a strategic geographical position. On the other, the West faced increasing difficulties, a declining economy, weakened armies, and an administration full of flaws. While the East strengthened its walls and accumulated wealth, the West was left at the mercy of internal crises and external invaders. The most curious thing, the division was not only territorial, it struck at the heart of Roman identity. Citizens began to identify more with the part in which they lived than with the empire as a whole. This loss of unity left the West in a vulnerable position. In critical situations, the East often refused to send troops or resources, leaving Rome to its own devices. The inequality between the parties grew like a wound that would not heal. This separation, which should have strengthened the empire, in fact transformed it into two hidden adversaries. While Constantinople shone as the new center of power, Rome became a shadow of its former self. and the internal competition between the leaders of the two parties only increased, creating political instability and opening the door to barbarian invaders. Now imagine the impact of this decision on an already fragile Rome. Did the common people have hope that this division would bring some benefit, or did they at some point realize that they were witnessing the beginning of the end? It's intriguing to think about. And if you were living in that period, what would have been your greatest fear as you watched the empire weaken? Think about that as we prepare to address the next piece of this puzzle. How corruption eroded Roman power from within and paved the way for its downfall. Mistake number 4, corruption and inefficiency. Have you ever wondered how such a great empire could crumble from within? The answer lies in something so familiar that it still shakes governments and societies today: corruption. At the height of its glory, Rome was known for its organization and discipline, but over time, these pillars began to crumble due to corrupt practices and increasingly inefficient administration. Emperors, who were supposed to lead wisely, became easy targets for manipulation, sometimes bribed by elites, sometimes sucked in by their own ambitions. Many came to power not through the strength of their ideas, but by buying support or using fear. This instability at the top was reflected throughout the administrative structure. Governors diverted resources, levied abusive taxes, and enriched themselves at the expense of the people's misery. The population, in turn, began to lose confidence in the system, which weakened social cohesion. An emblematic example was the sale of public offices. Imagine living in a place where the position of a judge or administrator could be bought. These figures, instead of serving the community, used their positions to obtain even more personal advantages. It is not difficult to imagine the chaos that this generated: unfair court decisions, abandoned public projects, and an increasingly slow and dysfunctional bureaucracy. Now, combine this with the fact that the empire faced constant pressure from invaders. While the legions fought to defend the borders, the resources that were supposed to finance these operations were diverted or mismanaged. Corruption, then, was not just an internal problem. It directly compromised Rome's ability to defend itself and prosper. Interestingly, even when attempts were made to reform the system, the effect was often the opposite. Some laws, created to control abuses, ended up being interpreted in a way that further benefited the powerful. It was like trying to put out a fire by throwing more fuel on it. This leads us to an important question: to what extent can a society resist when trust in its leaders is lost? Were the Romans of the time aware that corruption was undermining the foundations of their empire? Or were they, like us today, so accustomed to these abuses that they simply accepted the situation? In the next part, we will see how moral decay and the loss of fundamental values further aggravated this situation, accelerating Rome's decline. Stay with us and discover how such a brilliant empire succumbed to its own excesses. After all, even the strongest can fall if they forget what made them great. Mistake number 5. The decline of morals and values. How Rome lost the spirit that built it. Imagine Rome, the city that prided itself on its greatness, its victories in war, and its unwavering discipline. An empire that was forged by the strength of its values: patriotism, honor, courage, and uncompromising dedication to the public cause. These pillars sustained Rome for centuries, but over time, these same values began to erode, being replaced by something much more ephemeral and destructive. What happened? The decline of the Roman spirit was not something that happened overnight. Over the centuries, the Romans went from being a people who valued community and service to the country, to a society increasingly focused on materialism. The virtues that had once been celebrated, such as discipline, austerity, and honor, gave way to the unbridled pursuit of wealth and status. Instead of dedicating their lives to the service of the empire and the well-being of society, many began to prioritize personal comfort, forgetting the sacrifices that had been made to build the greatness of Rome. But what else accelerated this process? The growing influence of Christianity, which spread throughout the empire, began to directly challenge traditional Roman values. The old pagan beliefs, which supported the cult of military power and civic virtue, began to lose strength. Christianity brought with it a new vision of morality, with an emphasis on life after death and the avoidance of earthly disputes. The Christian faith, by condemning violence and the relentless pursuit of power, gradually eroded the pillars of a Rome that prided itself on its military strength and public morality. And here, a big question arises. With the rise of Christianity, did Rome really lose what made it unique? Or perhaps, was Rome itself doomed to fall because its citizens moved away from the values that made them great? Was this change in values inevitable, or were there choices that could have been made differently? Now, tell me, what do you think? Was Rome's decline a reflection of its natural evolution or a mistake in the management of the empire? Leave your opinion in the comments. Let's reflect together on what could have been different and what we can still learn from the mistakes of ancient Rome. Mistake number 6, military pressures and the reliance on mercenaries. The end of Roman loyalty. Rome had always prided itself on its army, one of the most powerful in the ancient world, responsible for conquering vast territories and keeping the empire constantly expanding. But as time passed, this army, which had once been the pillar of Roman security and stability, began to become an unsustainable burden. Instead of being the disciplined and loyal force that Rome had always been, the army was being shaped by foreign interests, resulting in a strategic error that would shake the foundation of the empire. What happened? At first, the Roman army was composed of loyal Roman citizens, trained and willing to fight for the greatness of Rome. But as the empire expanded and resources became scarcer, Rome began to rely on foreign mercenaries. These soldiers were well paid, but their loyalty was not to Rome, and this created a host of problems. Imagine the scenario. The Roman army, once made up of proud Romans, was now being supported by men from distant lands with entirely different cultures, values, and loyalties. These mercenaries were often more interested in their pay than in defending the empire. And in some cases, this lack of loyalty became a direct threat to the stability of Rome. A dramatic example of this was the mercenary commander Alaric, leader of the Visigoths, who, after being hired by the empire, turned his arms against Rome, becoming one of those responsible for its downfall. As the Roman army became more professional and increasingly dependent on mercenaries, Rome found itself without the internal cohesion that had characterized its military power for centuries. These foreign soldiers lacked the same commitment to Roman values, and in many cases they ended up being used for personal gain and even to usurp the power of weak emperors. The army, which was supposed to be a reflection of Roman greatness, became an unstable force, vulnerable to external and internal interests. Now think, if you were a Roman commander at the time, how would you have dealt with the increasing pressure to recruit mercenaries? Could the reliance on these soldiers have been avoided? Or was it inevitable given the size of the empire and the scarcity of resources? What else could Rome have done to avoid this fatal mistake? Leave your opinion in the comments, because it is always interesting to reflect together on these decisive moments in history. And before we move on to the next point, imagine the situation. A huge empire full of challenges and an army increasingly distant from its ideals. How could this affect Roman society in its day? The answer to this question will lead you to understand even more the complex factors that contributed to the fall of Rome. Mistake number 7, problems of succession. The struggle for the throne that wore Rome. The Roman Empire, a complex and intricate machine of governance, was not fortunate enough to be guided by a clear and stable system of imperial succession. When an emperor died, he left behind more than just a power vacuum. He left behind an arena of infighting that weakened the very heart of Rome. But what did this mean for the empire? How did the lack of a clear path to succession affect the fate of the greatest civilization in the ancient world? In early Rome, the imperial succession was not clear. In many cases, the successor was chosen by force, political skill, or even manipulation. This created a constant cycle of power struggles, which often escalated into bloody civil wars. For a dramatic example, consider Domitian, who ruled tyrannically and without leaving a clear heir, which led to political instability after his death. The empire was left vulnerable to internal disputes, with generals and elite members vying for control, and the public's trust waning. This political instability led to a series of crises that made it impossible for the empire to effectively deal with external threats. While Rome was weakened by internal wars, barbarian peoples such as the Visigoths and Vandals were lurking, waiting for an opportunity to invade. The lack of a strong and well-established system of succession not only undermined Rome's internal strength, but also prevented it from adapting to times of war and change. Now I wonder, what would have happened if Rome had been able to implement a clear system of succession? Would the empire have lasted longer, or were corruption and power struggles part of its inevitable fate? Let's reflect together on how this lack of clarity shaped the empire's downfall. Mistake number 8. Church growth, the spiritual power that turned Rome's eyes away. Have you ever considered that, at the same time that the Roman Empire was expanding across continents, something within its society was changing radically? The rise of the Catholic Church was one of the most complex and contradictory factors that affected Rome. Christianity brought spiritual unity and comfort to millions, but it was also the cause of deep divisions in the empire. As the church grew, so did its influence over the Roman population, something that the Roman emperors could not ignore. When Christianity became the official religion of the empire with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, things changed dramatically. The authority of priests and bishops rivaled that of the emperor himself, and the church began to divert resources that had previously been earmarked for military strength and public administration. More than that, Christianity, with its message of equality, came into direct conflict with the Roman hierarchical structure. Rome had always been a rigid society, with a clear distinction between social classes, and the Christian idea that all were equal before God profoundly challenged this system. Tensions between the state and the church became increasingly evident, and the empire found itself divided, not only between social classes, but also between those who supported the old paganism and those who converted to Christianity. Now, imagine, was Christianity a force for unification or division for Rome? How could such a vast empire sustain so much spiritual and secular power at the same time? And most importantly, was the growth of the church a factor that contributed to the fall of the empire? Tell us what you think in the comments. Your opinion is essential to understanding how these spiritual and social factors collided in unexpected ways. Mistake number 9. Dependence on slavery, the economy that collapsed under the weight of the past. If you were to look at ancient Rome with its vast estates and large agricultural properties, you would quickly realize something essential. The foundation of the Roman economy was built on the backs of slaves. But what seemed like a practical solution to the labor shortage became, over time, one of the empire's greatest structural problems. Rome relied heavily on slaves, not only for domestic tasks, but also for agriculture, mining, and even to keep the administrative machinery running. For centuries, this labor force allowed Rome to expand its territories and sustain its luxurious lifestyle. However, as territorial conquests began to decline, so did the supply of new slaves, and the system began to collapse. The number of available slaves dwindled, and the once thriving economy began to succumb to the lack of free labor and the scarcity of resources. Furthermore, slave revolts, such as the famous rebellion of Spartacus, showed how fragile this system really was. Social tensions increased, and the Roman working class began to feel the effects of the decline of the slave system. The lack of skilled labor and growing social inequality made the economy increasingly unsustainable. Now consider, was the dependence on slaves a fatal mistake for Rome? What would have happened if the empire had invested more in economic innovations or in the utilization of free labor? Have you found this interesting so far? Leave a like to let me know you like this type of content. Error number 10. Climate change and agricultural crises. The invisible collapse. Did you know that in addition to wars and political intrigues, the Roman Empire also suffered from forces far beyond human control? Climate change played a significant role in the decline of Rome, with periods of global cooling and crop failures. But how did this directly affect the empire? Let's take a look. The Romans were dependent on agriculture, and the stability of the empire was tied to agricultural production. However, during the late empire, climate change brought unfavorable conditions for agriculture. Periods of global cooling, such as the Little Ice Age, resulted in poor harvests, and famine spread across several regions of the empire. This created a domino effect. Food shortages led to rising prices, impoverishment of the lower classes, and ultimately greater social instability. Rome, already facing economic and political crises, now found itself in environmental collapse as well. The inability to adapt to these natural changes made the empire even more vulnerable. Attacks from barbarians, which had previously been easily repelled, became even more challenging since the empire was already weakened internally. But here's a thought. If Rome had been able to adapt its agriculture and infrastructure to climate change, would it have been possible to avoid this collapse? Or were these environmental crises beyond any human control at the time? Share your thoughts, because it's fascinating to ponder how the forces of nature can change the fate of entire empires. What really destroyed Rome? Have you ever wondered what it would have been like to live at the height of the Roman Empire when Rome was the largest and most powerful civilization in the world? But what really destroyed this great empire? The 10 fatal mistakes we've discussed throughout this video weren't just isolated mistakes. They formed a domino effect that, one by one, toppled the foundations of Rome. If it hadn't been for these choices and changes, would Rome still exist today? The answer is not so simple, but what we can learn from it is essential. Now, before you go around thinking that Rome was defeated only by armies and invasions, stop and think. What will happen to a society that ignores the signs of decline? When we lose our essence, our morals, and fail to maintain internal unity, any empire, large or small, is destined to face difficulties. But could the same thing happen to our modern societies? And more importantly, what can we do to prevent this from happening to us? Did you like this video? Then leave a comment. Which of these mistakes do you think had the greatest impact on the fall of Rome? And what's more, are you already seeing signs of something similar in our own society? Let's discuss together and reflect on how we can avoid the mistakes of the past. I'm curious to hear your opinion.